My mama said this bracelet belonged to someone who forgot us. The sentence was small, almost too soft for the crystal ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton, Boston, but it landed with enough force to turn every face toward the little black girl standing beneath the chandelier light. Eleanor Brooks, though everyone called her Ellie, was 8 years old, barely tall enough to see over the white linen registration table, and she wore a navy blue dress that had been carefully pressed but not new. Her braids were tied back with 2 white ribbons, her shoes had been polished until they shined in patches, and on her left wrist hung a thin silver bracelet, scratched, bent slightly at the clasp, old enough to look out of place among the diamond tennis bracelets, gold watches, and pearl cuffs floating through the room like quiet proof of wealth. Charles Whitmore noticed the bracelet before he noticed her face. That was the kind of man he had become. 52 years old, worth more than most people in that room could imagine, Charles had trained his eyes to measure things quickly: value, quality, weakness, risk. He could glance at a painting and know if a museum had overpaid. He could look at a handshake and sense whether a deal would survive. So when he saw the bracelet on the child's wrist while she stood in line for the Whitmore Future Scholars Foundation, he gave a short, dry laugh. It was not loud, not cruel in the theatrical way villains laughed in movies, but it was sharp enough, close enough. The woman beside him, a board member in a cream suit, followed his gaze and smiled politely, unsure whether she was supposed to laugh too. "That little thing," Charles murmured, lifting his champagne glass without drinking from it. "Someone told her it was an heirloom, I suppose." Ellie heard him. Her chin moved first, just a tiny lift, then her eyes found his across the space between them. They were not wet. They were not pleading. They were steady, deep brown, and far older than they should have been. The ballroom seemed to dim around her, not because the lights changed, but because something in the air tightened. A violin quartet played near the far wall, soft and perfect, but even. The music seemed to slip behind the sound of that child's breathing. Charles expected her to look away. Most adults looked away from him when they had been embarrassed. Most children simply froze. Ellie did neither. She stepped out of the line, one small hand covering the bracelet as if protecting it from the room, and walked toward him with the careful dignity of someone crossing a street she had been warned was dangerous. The guests nearby began to notice. Conversations thinned. A waiter paused with a silver tray balanced on one hand. At the scholarship table, a young volunteer whispered Ellie's name, but the girl did not turn around. She stopped 3 feet from Charles Whitmore, tilted her face upward, and said, "It belonged to my mama before it belonged to me." Charles blinked once, almost annoyed by how calm she sounded. "I'm sure it did," he replied, his voice smooth enough for donors and cold enough for distance. "But this is a formal event, young lady. People sometimes mistake sentimental things for valuable ones." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. The sentence had been dressed in manners, but everyone heard what it meant. Ellie's fingers tightened around the bracelet. For one moment, the child looked down at her wrist, and Charles saw the smallest tremor pass through her hand. Not fear, restraint. She was deciding what kind of person she would be in front of a room full of adults who had already decided what kind of child she was. Then she looked back at him. "Value is not always shiny," she said. Her voice did not rise. That made it worse for him. If she had shouted, he could have dismissed her. If she had cried, he could have handed her a tissue and moved on. But she stood there with those white ribbons in her braids and that dented silver circle on her wrist, answering him as if the world had asked a question and she was simply telling the truth. The board member beside Charles gave a nervous laugh, hoping to soften the moment. "Children say the most charming things," she said. Ellie did not look at her. "I'm not trying to be charming, ma'am." The waiter's tray dipped slightly. Somewhere behind them, a camera clicked, then stopped. Charles felt heat rise beneath his collar. Not shame exactly. Not yet, but irritation at being corrected in his own ballroom, at his own foundation gala, by a child whose application folder probably sat in a stack labeled Need-Based Review. He set his glass on a nearby table with a careful clink. "And who brought you here tonight?" he asked. "My mother," Ellie said. Then, after a beat, "My real mother is gone. My other mother brought me." That answer should have ended the conversation. It should have softened him. Instead, Charles reached for the safest weapon he knew: distance. "Then your other mother should have taught you not to interrupt donors." The room went still in a way even Charles could not ignore. Ellie's lips parted slightly, but she did not step back. Her hand slipped from the bracelet, revealing the scratched silver band beneath the chandelier light. For the first time, Charles saw that the bracelet was not cheap costume jewelry. It was old, yes, worn thin at the edges, but the metal had a quiet, stubborn glow. Handcrafted, not mass-produced. Something about the curve of it tugged at a place in his mind he had locked years ago. He frowned. Ellie noticed the change before anyone else did. Children who grow up listening closely learn to see the smallest shifts in adults. The pause before anger, the breath before apology, the blink before a lie. Charles Whitmore had just lost half a second of certainty, and Ellie saw it. "There are letters inside," she said. Charles heard the words as if they had come from the far end of a tunnel. "What did you say?" Ellie turned the bracelet slowly around her wrist. "Initials. My mama said if anyone ever laughed at it, I should let them laugh. But if anyone ever recognized it, I should listen." The air left Charles's chest with such quiet force that the woman beside him glanced at his face. He tried to speak, but no words came. Ellie unclasped the bracelet. The tiny hinge resisted, then opened with a faint metallic click that sounded impossibly loud beneath the chandeliers. She held it out, not like an offering, and not like a beggar asking for approval, but like a witness presenting evidence. Charles stared at the bracelet in her palm. He did not take it at first. His hand remained at his side, fingers curled, his expensive cufflinks catching the light. Then he reached forward. The silver was warm from the child's skin when it touched his palm. He turned it gently, almost unwillingly, until the inside faced up. At first, all he saw were scratches. Then the letters appeared beneath the wear, small but unmistakable, carved by a jeweler's hand a lifetime ago. CWAM forever. The ballroom vanished. The donors, the violin music, the polished marble, the cameras, the foundation banners with his name printed in navy and gold, all of it fell away. Charles was no longer standing in Boston under chandelier light. He was 28 again on a rainy afternoon in Charleston, holding the hand of a woman named Amelia Moore, hearing her laugh as she told him rich men always believed time belonged to them. His throat tightened so suddenly it hurt. The bracelet shook once in his hand. Ellie watched him carefully. "Sir?" she asked. Charles looked up at her, and for the first time that evening, he truly saw the child's face. Not the dress, not the shoes, not the application folder clutched in her other hand. Her face, the shape of her eyes, the small, brave line of her mouth, the quiet defiance that did not ask permission to exist. Behind him, someone said his name, but Charles did not turn. The initials glimmered in his palm, like a door opening from the wrong side of time. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. Ellie's answer came soft, clear, and steady. "It was wrapped in my baby blanket." The bracelet remained in Charles Whitmore's hand long after Ellie finished speaking. Around them, the ballroom slowly remembered how to breathe. A violinist missed a note. Someone cleared their throat. Glasses clinked softly in the distance. Yet Charles heard almost none of it. His eyes remained fixed on the tiny initials carved into the silver. CWAM forever. The letters looked impossibly small for something powerful enough to crack open 24 years of silence. "That is not possible," he said quietly. The words sounded more like a prayer than a statement. Ellie tilted her head. "What is not possible?" He looked at her, then back at the bracelet. His heart was moving too fast. Amelia Moore had disappeared from his life before many of the people in this room had even heard his name. Back then he had not owned skyscrapers, private jets, or foundations. He had only been a young man foolish enough to believe he could build a future and stubborn enough to think love would wait while he chased it. Yet here was a child standing in front of him with something that should not exist. "Where is your mother?" Charles asked. Ellie answered carefully. "At home. Your mother gave you this?" "My real mother left it for me." The answer landed heavily between them. Charles swallowed. "And who told you that?" Ellie looked down briefly at the bracelet before meeting his eyes again. "My mom, Grace. She said it was wrapped inside my baby blanket when I was a baby. She said the bracelet was the only thing that came with me." Charles felt his grip tighten. Across the ballroom, several guests had stopped pretending not to watch. He could feel their curiosity gathering like a storm cloud. Normally, he would have hated that. Tonight, he barely noticed. "Did Grace tell you who your real mother was?" Ellie shook her head. "No." "Did she tell you where you came from?" "No." Another shake of her head. "She said she did not know." Charles stared at her for several seconds. He was searching for something impossible, a familiar expression, a forgotten smile, some evidence that could explain why his chest suddenly felt too small. But all he found was a little girl standing straight despite being surrounded by strangers with more money than she could imagine. Then another voice entered the moment. Charles. He knew that voice instantly. Margaret Whitmore. His mother approached from the far side of the ballroom with the calm elegance that had intimidated senators, executives, and journalists for decades. At 76, she still moved through a room as though she owned every square foot of it. Her silver necklace caught the chandelier light as she stopped beside him. The board members are waiting, she said smoothly. Then her gaze shifted toward Ellie. The polite smile on her face remained unchanged until she noticed the bracelet in Charles's hand. For the briefest fraction of a second, something flickered in her eyes. Fear. It disappeared so quickly that anyone else would have missed it. Charles did not. Mother, he said slowly, have you ever seen this bracelet before? Margaret's smile tightened. Should I have? Charles turned the silver band so the initials faced her. He watched her carefully. The color drained from her face so subtly most people would never have noticed. But Charles had spent his entire life learning how to read negotiations. And right now, his mother looked exactly like someone trying not to lose a deal. It is old jewelry, Margaret replied. Nothing more. Ellie glanced between them. She could feel the shift in the air even if she did not understand it. Charles continued staring at his mother. Look closer. Margaret did not move. Charles, this is neither the time nor the place. Do you recognize the initials? Silence stretched. A few feet away, a donor quietly stepped backward to give them space. Margaret's eyes finally landed on the letters. CWAM forever. Her jaw tightened. Then she looked directly at Ellie. Not at her dress. Not at her shoes. At her face. Something unreadable passed across the older woman's expression. Who is this child? She asked. Ellie answered before Charles could. My name is Eleanor Brooks. Margaret stared a second longer than necessary. Then she smiled again. But this smile felt manufactured, assembled piece by piece rather than felt. A lovely name. Charles knew that smile. He had seen it in boardrooms, press conferences, and family disputes. It was the smile she wore whenever she was hiding something. Mother, he said quietly, why are you nervous? The question struck harder than if he had raised his voice. Margaret blinked once. I am not nervous. Then answer me. Another pause. Ellie remained silent. Every instinct told her she was standing inside a conversation much older than she was. I do not know anything about that bracelet, Margaret finally said. And if I did, this would not be the place to discuss it. Then she reached out and gently touched Charles's arm. You are allowing yourself to become emotional. Emotional. The word irritated him immediately, not because it was inaccurate, but because it sounded rehearsed, like she had expected to use it. Charles looked down at the bracelet again. Suddenly, he noticed something he had missed before. Near the clasp, almost hidden beneath years of wear, was a tiny engraved symbol, a small crescent moon. His breath caught. Amelia loved moons. She used to sketch them on napkins, notebooks, even the margins of letters she sent him. No jeweler could have accidentally chosen that mark. The bracelet slipped slightly in his hand as another memory surfaced. Amelia laughing beside a harbor. Amelia tracing a silver bracelet around her wrist. Amelia saying, if you ever forget me, Charles Whitmore, I will haunt your conscience forever. He had laughed then. He was not laughing now. Across from him, Ellie watched every emotion cross his face. Sir, she asked softly. Charles looked at her. The ballroom seemed smaller than before. The noise more distant. The questions louder. He glanced once more toward his mother. Margaret was already recovering her composure, but the crack had appeared. He had seen it. And once seen, it could never be unseen. Ellie, he said carefully, would you mind sitting with me for a few minutes? The little girl hesitated. Then she surprised him. Are you asking because of me? She said. Or because of the bracelet? For the first time that evening, Charles had no immediate answer. Charles Whitmore had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without breaking eye contact. He had testified before government committees, stood before hostile shareholders, and survived economic storms that destroyed entire industries. Yet the question from an 8-year-old girl left him searching for words. Ellie remained still, her brown eyes fixed on him, waiting. Not demanding, not accusing, simply waiting. Around them, The gala continued in cautious whispers. Charles glanced toward the private lounge beside the ballroom and finally nodded. Both, he admitted. I want to understand the bracelet, and I want to understand you. Ellie studied him for another moment before giving a small shrug. Okay. Together they walked toward the quieter room off the main hall. The thick carpet softened every footstep. Behind them, Margaret Whitmore watched in silence. Her expression remained composed, but her hands were clasped tighter than usual. Inside the lounge, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Boston skyline. City lights shimmered against the dark harbor beyond. Charles pulled out a chair for Ellie. She sat carefully, placing her scholarship application folder on her lap. The bracelet remained in his hand. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Charles turned the silver band once more beneath the lamplight. That was when he noticed something else. Near the inside edge, hidden among years of scratches, was a tiny engraving he had missed before. Not a jeweler's mark. Not decoration. A date. October 14th. Charles felt a chill run through him. Amelia's birthday. He remembered buying her a slice of chocolate cake at a small bakery because neither of them could afford anything fancier. He remembered her laughing when he apologized for not having a better gift. Most of all, he remembered the bracelet. The realization struck him so suddenly that he stood up from his chair. Ellie blinked. What happened? Charles lowered himself back down slowly. His voice had become almost a whisper. I know this bracelet. The room seemed to grow quieter. Ellie looked from his face to the bracelet and back again. You do? Charles nodded. His eyes remained fixed on the silver. I gave it to someone a long time ago. Ellie stopped breathing for a second. My mother? Charles closed his eyes briefly. A woman named Amelia Moore. The name hung between them like a note from an old song. Ellie repeated it softly. Amelia. It was clear she had never heard the name before. Charles leaned forward. Did Grace ever mention that name? Ellie shook her head. No. A strange sadness crossed her face. I do not know anything about my real mother. Charles felt something twist inside his chest. For years he had convinced himself that Amelia had simply chosen another path. It had hurt, but eventually he had buried the pain beneath work, success, and endless responsibilities. Now that explanation felt thinner by the minute. How long have you lived with Grace? He asked. Since forever. Did she adopt you? Ellie nodded. She says I became her daughter the day she first held me. A faint smile touched Charles's face. That sounds like something a good mother would say. Ellie smiled too, but only for a second. Then her expression grew serious again. Why did your face change when you saw the bracelet? Charles looked out toward the harbor lights. The answer should have been simple. Instead it felt enormous. Before he could speak, the lounge door opened quietly. Daniel Pierce stepped inside. Tall, calm, and impeccably dressed, Daniel had served as Charles's attorney for nearly 15 years. One glance told him something unusual was happening. You asked for me? Daniel said. Charles nodded immediately. I need a favor. Daniel looked toward Ellie, then toward the bracelet. His lawyer instincts activated at once. What kind of favor? Charles handed him the bracelet. I need you to find out everything you can about this. Daniel examined the engraving carefully. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Tonight. Daniel knew better than to argue. He studied the initials, the date, and the crescent moon symbol. Then he looked directly at Charles. You believe this is connected to Amelia Moore? It was not a question. Charles gave a slow nod. Daniel's expression sharpened. He remembered the name. Very few people in Charles Whitmore's inner circle knew anything about Amelia. Fewer still understood how much she had once mattered. I will start immediately, Daniel said. He slipped the bracelet into a protective cloth pouch and stood. Before leaving, he glanced at Ellie. That is a very important bracelet. Ellie answered with surprising confidence. I know. After Daniel left, silence settled once again. Outside, the lights of Boston reflected across the dark water like scattered stars. Charles sat across from Ellie, feeling as though the past had suddenly opened a door he never expected to see again. Then Ellie reached into her folder. There is something else. Charles looked up. Carefully, she removed a folded piece of paper. The edges were worn from being opened many times. Grace found this with the bracelet, Ellie said. She always kept it safe. Charles accepted the paper slowly. His fingers trembled before he even unfolded it. Because deep down, before seeing a single word, he already knew that whatever waited inside was about to change everything. Charles stared at the folded paper for several seconds before opening it. The room felt smaller now, as though the walls themselves were listening. Across from him, Ellie sat quietly with her hands folded in her lap. She was nervous, but she was trying very hard not to show it. Charles unfolded the paper carefully. The page was yellowed with age. A faint crease ran through the center. For a moment, the handwriting blurred as memories rushed ahead of his eyes. Then the words came into focus. To my little girl, if you are reading this one day, it means life did not follow the path I hoped for. But I want you to know something. You were loved before you were born. You were loved every day after. And somewhere in this world, there is a man who loved you too before he even knew your name. Charles stopped reading. His throat tightened. He recognized the handwriting instantly. Amelia. Every curve of every letter belonged to her. 24 years disappeared in a heartbeat. He could almost hear her voice. Ellie watched his expression change. You know who wrote it. It was not a question. Charles nodded slowly. Yes. His voice sounded rough. I do. Ellie leaned forward slightly. Was she a good person? The question struck him harder than anything else that evening. He looked down at the letter again. A small smile appeared despite the storm inside him. She was the kindest person I ever knew. Ellie lowered her eyes. For a second, she seemed relieved, like a child who had spent years wondering whether her missing mother had been worth remembering. Charles continued reading. The next lines made his pulse quicken. If anything ever happens to me, keep the bracelet safe. The initials inside will matter one day. The moon beside them is our promise. A promise that truth eventually finds its way home. Charles stopped again. The crescent moon. Amelia had placed it there intentionally, not as decoration, as a message. His fingers tightened around the paper. Then his eyes moved lower. If Charles ever sees this, tell him I never stopped believing in him. The room went silent. Completely silent. Even the distant sounds of the gala seemed to vanish. Charles stared at the sentence for so long that Ellie finally whispered, "What does it say?" He looked up at her. There was no easy way to answer. Before he could speak, the lounge door opened again. This time Margaret Whitmore entered. Her posture remained elegant, but there was urgency beneath her composure. Charles, we need to talk. Charles folded the letter carefully. Not now. Now. Margaret's voice was calm, but firm. Ellie immediately sensed the tension. She glanced between them. Margaret looked at the child and offered a polite smile. Would you excuse us for a moment, Eleanor? Before Ellie could answer, Charles spoke. She stays. The response surprised everyone, including him. Margaret's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. She closed the door behind her. You are making assumptions based on old memories and a bracelet. Charles stood slowly. Then explain why Amelia wrote my name. Margaret remained silent. Explain why she left this letter. Silence again. Charles stepped closer. Explain why you looked frightened when you saw the bracelet. For the first time, Margaret's confidence cracked. Not dramatically, just enough. Her eyes drifted toward the harbor lights beyond the glass windows. Some truths belong in the past. Charles felt anger rise, not explosive anger, but the kind that came from years of unanswered questions. Not this one. Margaret folded her hands together. You spent decades building your life. Your company. Your foundation. Everything you have today came because you moved forward. That is not an answer. Sometimes answers only create pain. Charles laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Then someone has been protecting themselves, not me. Margaret's eyes flashed. For a moment, she looked older than her years. Tired. Burdened. Then she noticed the folded letter in his hand. Her face changed. Immediately. Where did that come from? Charles did not answer. The reaction told him everything he needed to know. Margaret already knew the letter existed. Ellie saw it too. The realization widened her eyes. You have seen this before. The words escaped before she could stop them. Margaret looked toward the little girl. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Margaret said something that made the temperature in the room seem to drop. There are things about your birth that you do not understand. Charles froze. Ellie froze. The sentence hung in the air like a bell after it had been struck. Not your mother. Not your bracelet. Your birth. Margaret immediately realized what she had revealed. Her eyes closed briefly. Too late. Charles took a step forward. What did you just say? Margaret looked away. Outside the windows, Boston shimmered beneath the night sky. Inside the lounge, a secret buried for almost a quarter century had finally begun to surface. Charles stared at his mother as the silence stretched between them. Margaret Whitmore rarely made mistakes with words. She measured every sentence the way an architect measured steel beams. Yet one careless phrase had shifted everything. Ellie remained motionless in her chair, her small hands folded tightly together. She did not fully understand what was happening, but she understood enough to know that everyone in the room was suddenly afraid of the truth. Margaret exhaled slowly. "You are hearing what you want to hear." Charles shook his head. "No, I am hearing what you accidentally said." His voice remained calm, but the calmness felt dangerous. "You did not mention the bracelet. You did not mention Amelia. You mentioned her birth." Margaret looked toward the windows again. The city lights reflected across the glass, turning the room into a mirror filled with ghosts. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Ellie quietly broke the silence. "Do you know something about me?" The question sounded impossibly small inside the large room. Margaret looked at her. For the first time that evening, the older woman's expression softened. Not completely, just enough to reveal a trace of something hidden beneath decades of control, regret. Ellie noticed it immediately. Children often notice the emotions adults tried hardest to hide. "I know some things about the past," Margaret said carefully. "That is all." "Then tell us," Charles replied. Margaret's eyes closed briefly. "It is not that simple." Charles laughed once, quietly. "It never is." The lounge door opened again before anyone could continue. Daniel Pierce returned carrying a tablet and a thin folder. One look at the room told him he had interrupted something important. Still, the urgency in his expression left no room for delay. "I found something." Charles turned immediately. "Already?" Daniel nodded. "Enough to know we need to keep digging." He placed the folder on the table. Margaret's posture stiffened the moment she saw it. Daniel opened the file and slid a photocopied document toward Charles. Providence Medical Center. 24 years ago. Charles scanned the page. His pulse quickened. Near the middle of the document appeared a familiar name. Amelia Moore. Below it were several medical entries and administrative notes. Most had been partially redacted. One line, however, remained visible. Female infant transferred under emergency guardianship review. Charles looked up sharply. "Transferred where?" Daniel shook his head. "That section is missing." Margaret looked away. Daniel noticed. So did Charles. The attorney continued. "There is more." He pulled another page from the folder. The original record was accessed years later. Charles examined the notation. One individual had requested information regarding the infant's status. The request had been denied. Who made the request? Charles asked. Daniel met his eyes. Amelia Moore. The room went completely silent. Ellie leaned forward slightly. Even she understood the significance of that answer. Charles stared at the page. Amelia, try to find her. Daniel nodded. According to this record, yes. The realization hit Charles with crushing force. For years he had believed Amelia walked away from him. Yet here was evidence suggesting she had spent time searching for a child she could not reach. Suddenly the story he had told himself for decades no longer made sense. When was this request filed? Charles asked. Daniel checked the document. 8 months after the birth. Charles lowered his head. 8 months. 8 months of questions. 8 months of searching. 8 months of believing there was still hope. Across the room, Margaret remained silent. Too silent. Daniel noticed it as well. There is one other thing. He hesitated. The person who approved the denial was not hospital staff. Charles slowly looked up. Who was it? Daniel's voice dropped. A private legal representative acting on behalf of a family trust. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Charles already knew the answer before Daniel spoke again. The Whitmore Family Trust. Ellie looked from one face to another. She could feel the room changing around her. Secrets were no longer hiding in shadows. They were stepping into the light one by one. Charles turned toward his mother. His expression had changed completely now. The confusion was gone. The uncertainty was fading. Something else had taken its place. Determination. Mother, he said quietly, tell me I am wrong. Margaret remained seated. Her hands rested motionless in her lap. For the first time in many years, she looked tired. Truly tired. The kind of exhaustion that came from carrying the same secret for too long. When she finally spoke, her voice barely rose above a whisper. I thought I was protecting everyone. Charles closed his eyes. The words felt like a door unlocking somewhere deep in the past. Ellie sat frozen, her heart racing as she watched the adults around her confront a truth that seemed larger than any of them. Outside, Boston glittered beneath the night sky. Inside the lounge, the distance between a billionaire, a forgotten love, and a little girl with a silver bracelet had suddenly become much smaller than anyone ever imagined. Charles did not respond immediately. He stood beside the window, overlooking Boston Harbor, while the weight of his mother's confession settled over the room. The city lights shimmered across the dark water like fragments of memory scattered across time. Behind him, Ellie remained seated, watching quietly. Daniel closed the folder and waited. Nobody seemed eager to break the silence. Finally, Charles spoke. Protecting everyone from what? Margaret lowered her eyes. For years, she had been the strongest person in every room she entered. Tonight, she looked smaller somehow. Not weaker, but burdened. From consequences, she answered softly. Charles turned toward her. Whose consequences? Margaret took a slow breath. Yours. Amelia's. The family's. The answer only deepened the confusion. Charles shook his head. You separated a mother from her child because you were worried about consequences? Margaret flinched at the accusation. Ellie noticed it immediately. The older woman folded her hands together. You do not understand what things were like back then. Then help me understand. Margaret looked toward Ellie before speaking again. 24 years ago, your company was preparing for its public offering. Investors were watching every move you made. Reporters followed you everywhere. The board believed any personal controversy could destroy everything. Charles stared at her in disbelief. So you chose a business plan over people. Margaret closed her eyes. I chose certainty. Daniel remained silent, but his expression revealed what he thought of that explanation. Across the room, Ellie slowly lowered her gaze to her hands. For most of her life, she had imagined her missing mother as a mystery. Now that mystery was turning into real people with real choices. Somehow that felt even more complicated. Did Amelia know? Ellie asked quietly. Everyone looked at her. Margaret hesitated. Not at first. Charles felt his pulse quicken. What does that mean? Margaret looked toward him. She was told the child had been placed somewhere safe. Somewhere safe, Charles repeated. That is what you told her? Margaret nodded once. I believed it was true. Charles laughed bitterly. Believed? The word echoed through the room. Before Margaret could answer, Daniel's phone vibrated. He glanced down at the screen and frowned. Then he looked up. I have another update. The room immediately shifted. Daniel rarely interrupted unless something mattered. He opened his tablet and pulled up a scanned document. I found records. Connected to Grace Brooks. Ellie straightened in her chair. Charles stepped closer. Daniel continued. Grace was working as a pediatric nurse at Providence Medical Center during the same period. Ellie blinked. My mom worked there. Daniel nodded. According to these records, yes. Charles exchanged a glance with him. Both men immediately understood the significance. Grace had not entered Ellie's life by accident. Daniel scrolled further. There is more. He enlarged another document. Approximately 6 months after the guardianship transfer, Grace filed paperwork requesting emergency foster placement for an unnamed infant. Ellie stared at the screen. Charles stared too. Unnamed. Daniel nodded. The child's name had been temporarily sealed. Margaret slowly sank deeper into her chair. The color was fading from her face again. Charles noticed. You already knew this. Margaret did not answer. She did not have to. The silence said enough. Daniel continued reading. The request was approved. 3 years later, Grace formally adopted the child. Ellie's eyes widened. She pressed a hand against her chest. Me? Daniel gave a small nod. Yes. The realization settled over the room. Grace had not simply found Ellie. She had chosen her, fought for her, raised her, loved her. A faint smile touched Ellie's face despite everything else happening around her. I knew she loved me, she whispered. I just never knew how much. Charles looked at the child and felt something unexpected. Respect. Not because she was connected to Amelia, not because of the bracelet, but because even now, standing at the center of a life-changing mystery, she was thinking about gratitude instead of anger. Then Daniel spoke again. There is one final detail. His tone changed. Everyone noticed. He zoomed in on a signature at the bottom of one document. Charles leaned closer. So did Margaret. The signature belonged to Grace Brooks. Beneath it, in different handwriting, appeared a second signature. Amelia Moore. The room froze. Charles stared at the screen. Amelia had signed the document. Not years later. Not after losing contact. At the beginning. Which meant Amelia had known Grace. Trusted. Grace. Possibly chosen Grace. They knew each other, Charles whispered. Daniel nodded. Very well, it seems. Ellie's heart raced. For the first time that night, the story was beginning to form a shape. Her mother, Grace, Amelia, the bracelet, the letter. None of them were random pieces. They belonged together. Then Charles looked at Daniel. Can you find Grace? Daniel did not hesitate. I already started. Outside the lounge, the gala music continued drifting through the hotel. Donors laughed. Glasses clinked. Conversations carried on. But inside that room, another world had emerged. A world built from old promises, hidden records, and a little girl whose life had become the missing chapter in a story nobody had fully understood until now. Daniel's phone rang less than 10 minutes later. The sound seemed unusually loud inside the quiet lounge. Everyone looked up at once. Daniel checked the screen and immediately answered. Yes. He listened for several seconds without speaking. Then his expression changed. Are you certain? Another pause. Send me everything. He ended the call and looked directly at Charles. We found Grace. Ellie sat forward so quickly that her chair nearly moved. Is she okay? Daniel nodded. She is fine. Relief washed across Ellie's face. Charles noticed it immediately. Even with the possibility of discovering life-changing answers, her first concern had been for the woman who raised her. Daniel opened a newly received file on his tablet. Grace currently lives in Hartford, Connecticut. Ellie smiled faintly. That is where we live. Daniel continued. But that is not the important part. The room grew still again. Charles crossed his arms. Then what is? Daniel enlarged a scanned photograph. It appeared to be taken many years earlier. The image showed two young women standing outside a hospital entrance. One was clearly Grace Brooks. The other made Charles stop breathing. Amelia, younger, smiling. Her dark hair moved in the wind. Her arm rested around Grace's shoulder. They looked less like co-workers and more like sisters. Charles stared at the photograph for a long moment. He had not seen Amelia's face in nearly a quarter-century. Yet he recognized her instantly. Some memories never faded. Across the room, Margaret looked away. Daniel zoomed further into the image. Written on the back was a handwritten note. For Grace. Thank you for always standing beside me. Love, Amelia. Ellie stared at the screen. My mom knew her. Daniel nodded. Very well. Charles lowered himself into a chair. Every answer seemed to create 3 new questions. There is more, Daniel said. Grace kept correspondence for years. Charles looked up sharply. Letters. Daniel nodded. Dozens of them. Margaret closed her eyes. The movement was small but noticeable. Charles saw it. Daniel continued. Most were exchanged before Ellie's birth. Some afterward. Charles leaned forward. And Daniel took a slow breath. One letter mentions a meeting. The room went silent again. Daniel read directly from the document. If anything happens and I cannot raise her myself, promise me she will know she was loved. Promise me she will know who her father is. Charles felt his chest tighten. Ellie sat frozen. Even Daniel's voice softened. The letter is signed by Amelia. Nobody spoke. The words seemed too important to interrupt. Outside the windows, a ferry moved slowly across the harbor. Tiny lights reflected across the black water. Inside the lounge, decades of misunderstanding continued to unravel. Then Ellie asked the question nobody else had been brave enough to ask. Did she write his name? Daniel looked down at the document. Yes. Charles felt his pulse hammering. Daniel met his eyes. She wrote Charles Whitmore. The room became perfectly still. Ellie looked at Charles. Charles looked at Ellie. Neither knew what to say. For years Charles had believed Amelia disappeared without explanation. Now evidence suggested she had planned for a future where their child might someday find him. Not forget him. Find him. Margaret slowly stood. Everyone turned toward her. She seemed older than she had only an hour earlier. The careful confidence that usually surrounded her was beginning to disappear. I never knew about those letters, she said quietly. Charles studied her face. For the first time that night, he believed her. Whatever role she had played in the past, this discovery surprised her too. Daniel checked another message arriving on his tablet. His eyebrows rose. There is one final item. Charles almost laughed. Every final item seemed to lead to another mystery. What now? Daniel enlarged a digital copy of a sealed envelope. Across the front, written in Amelia's handwriting, were 7 simple words. To be opened when she asks. Ellie stared at the screen. Who asks? Daniel looked at her. Then he smiled gently. I think the letter means you. The little girl stopped breathing for a second. The envelope had been preserved by Grace all these years. Waiting. Not for Charles. Not for Margaret. Not for lawyers or investigators. Waiting for Ellie. A letter written decades ago by a mother she never knew. A message prepared long before this night began. Charles looked at the image, then at Ellie. The child who had entered the gala hoping for a scholarship was now standing at the center of a story that had been waiting for her since before she could walk. And somewhere in Hartford, Connecticut, Grace Brooks had been protecting that story all along. For several moments, nobody spoke. The image of the sealed envelope remained on the tablet screen, illuminated by the soft glow of the lounge lamp. Ellie could not stop staring at it. 24 years. The letter had waited 24 years. Not lost. Not forgotten. Waiting. The thought made her heart race. Charles sat beside the window, his hands clasped together. He had spent the entire evening chasing answers. Yet somehow the existence of that envelope affected him more than any hospital record or legal document. Amelia had expected this moment. Somehow, she had believed their daughter would one day ask the questions that nobody else could answer. Daniel carefully enlarged the image. The envelope looked old, but remarkably preserved. The edges had yellowed slightly with age. Across the front, Amelia's handwriting remained clear and elegant. To be opened when she asks. Ellie finally looked away from the screen. "Did Grace ever tell you about it?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "No. She never mentioned it during any records search." Charles understood immediately what that meant. Grace had protected the letter intentionally. Not from the world. From the wrong moment. Margaret remained standing near the window. She had grown unusually quiet. The discoveries of the evening had stripped away much of her certainty. For the first time in years, she seemed unsure of what came next. "When can we get it?" Ellie asked softly. Daniel checked another message. "Grace is willing to meet." Charles looked up immediately. "Tonight." Daniel nodded. "She said there is no reason to wait any longer." The words settled heavily across the room. No reason to wait any longer. Charles felt something shift inside him. For decades, he had lived surrounded by schedules, contracts, and carefully planned timelines. Yet the most important answers of his life were now moving according to something far older than business. They were moving according to truth. Ellie lowered her eyes. She suddenly looked younger than she had all evening. Not because she was afraid, but because hope can make even the bravest child vulnerable. "What if the letter changes everything?" she whispered. Charles looked at her. Then, after a moment, he smiled gently. "I think everything already changed." Ellie considered that answer. Slowly, she nodded. Outside the lounge, the gala was beginning to wind down. Guests gathered coats and exchanged final conversations beneath the chandeliers. None of them realized that the evening's most important event had happened far from the ballroom stage. It had happened in a quiet room overlooking Boston Harbor. Daniel's tablet vibrated again. Another message. He read it carefully, then looked at Charles. "There is something else Grace wants you to know before you arrive." Charles felt his pulse quicken. "What?" Daniel hesitated. Even he seemed surprised. "Grace says Amelia left more than one letter." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Daniel continued. "The envelope for Ellie is only the first one." Charles stared at him. "How many are there?" Daniel looked back at the message. 3. Ellie blinked. Margaret slowly lowered herself into a chair. Daniel continued reading. "One letter is addressed to Ellie. One is addressed to Charles Whitmore." The room fell silent again. Charles felt the air leave his lungs. A letter. Amelia had written a letter directly to him. Not years later. Not after someone found old records. She had written it back then. She had expected the possibility that one day he would learn the truth. Daniel's voice softened. "And the third letter." He stopped. Charles looked up. "What about it?" Daniel met his eyes. The third letter was addressed to Margaret Whitmore. Nobody breathed. Margaret's face lost all color. The harbor lights shimmered across the glass behind her. For the first time that evening, fear appeared openly in her eyes. Not fear of exposure. Not fear of embarrassment. Fear of something she had never read. Something Amelia had wanted her to hear. 24 years ago. Charles looked toward his mother. Margaret stared at the floor. And suddenly everyone in the room understood the same thing. The night was no longer about discovering what had happened in the past. The night was about finally hearing what Amelia Moore had been trying to say all along. The drive to Hartford began less than an hour later. Rain tapped softly against the windows of the black SUV as Boston disappeared behind them. Ellie sat in the back seat beside Daniel, holding the photograph of Amelia and Grace with both hands. She had looked at it so many times during the trip that she could almost memorize every detail. Charles sat across from her, unusually quiet. The highway lights flashed across the glass, illuminating his face for brief moments before darkness returned. Nobody seemed eager to speak. They were all moving toward answers that had waited 24 years. Just after midnight, they arrived at a modest brick home on a quiet street lined with maple trees. A single porch light glowed warmly against the darkness. Before the vehicle had fully stopped, Ellie recognized it. "Home," she whispered. The word carried a different meaning now. Charles looked at the small house. It was not large. It was not impressive. Yet somehow it felt more important than any building he owned. Grace Brooks opened the front door before they reached the porch. Her eyes immediately found Ellie. Relief flooded her face. The little girl ran forward and wrapped her arms around her. Grace held her tightly. Neither spoke for several seconds. Charles watched quietly. The reunion stirred something deep inside him. This woman had spent 24 years doing what he never knew needed to be done. She had raised Ellie, protected her, loved her. Grace finally looked up. Her eyes met Charles's. For a moment, neither moved. Then Grace nodded. "You came." Charles nodded back. "I did." Inside the house, everything felt warm. Family photographs covered the walls. Books set neatly on shelves. A small lamp illuminated the living room. Nothing about the place suggested wealth. Everything about it suggested care. On the coffee table rested 3 sealed envelopes. The sight of them immediately changed the atmosphere. Grace sat slowly in a nearby chair. "Amelia gave these to me before she passed away." Charles felt his breath catch. Even after all the discoveries of the evening, hearing Amelia described in the past tense still hurt. Grace placed a gentle hand on the envelopes. "She told me there might come a day when the truth finally found its way back." Ellie sat beside her. Charles remained standing. Margaret stood quietly near the doorway. Nobody knew what to say. Grace picked up the first envelope and handed it to Ellie. The little girl's fingers trembled as she accepted it. Slowly she opened it. The room remained silent while her eyes moved across the page. At first she smiled. Then tears filled her eyes. Not tears of sadness. Something softer. Something deeper. Grace squeezed her hand. "What does it say?" Charles asked gently. Ellie looked up. Her voice shook slightly. "She says she wanted me every day." The room went still. Ellie continued reading. "She says being separated from me was never her choice." Charles closed his eyes. Every word confirmed what he had begun to suspect. Amelia had never abandoned her daughter. She had loved her from the beginning. Ellie wiped her eyes and smiled through her tears. "She says Grace was her hero." Grace looked away, overcome with emotion. Then Charles reached for the second envelope. His name appeared in Amelia's handwriting. Seeing it nearly broke him. He opened the letter carefully. The familiar script greeted him immediately. "Dear Charles, if you are reading this, then somehow the truth survived longer than the lies." His hands trembled. He continued reading silently. Amelia wrote about hope, about forgiveness, about believing he would eventually learn what happened. She never accused him, never blamed him. The kindness in her words felt almost unbearable. Then he reached the final paragraph. "Please do not spend your future punishing yourself for the past. Spend it loving the little girl who carries both our stories." Charles lowered the letter. Tears filled his eyes for the first time in years. Across the room, Ellie watched him quietly. Then only one envelope remained. Margaret stared at it as though it weighed 100 pounds. Grace picked it up and held it out. After a long hesitation, Margaret accepted it. The room remained silent while she read. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. As her eyes moved across the page, something changed. The tension she had carried all evening slowly disappeared. By the time she reached the end, tears were streaming down her face. She folded the letter carefully. "What did she say?" Charles asked softly. Margaret looked up. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "She forgave me." Nobody spoke. The words settled gently over the room. Forgiveness. After everything. After all the years. Amelia had chosen forgiveness. Margaret closed her eyes. "I do not deserve it." Grace shook her head. "Maybe not." But she gave it anyway. Silence filled the house once more. Then something unexpected happened. Ellie stood, walked across the room, and held out the silver bracelet. She looked directly at Charles. "My mother wanted truth to find its way home." Charles stared at the bracelet. Then he looked at Ellie. Not at the mystery anymore. Not at the evidence. Not at the possibility. At Ellie, the child who had carried the truth all along. Slowly he knelt so they were eye level. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. Then I promise I will never forget again.